Hello, heretics. This is Lilith. I'm here with Rene, and we are Veritas Voices. I hope you're all having a wonderful week. And we're here to talk today about anti-theism, atheism versus anti-theism. A lot of people will make generalizations about atheists, which really are more about anti-theists. People who genuinely oppose religious faith as something bad, toxic, undesirable, what have you. That's, I guess, what a lot of people would call angry atheists.
Or militant atheists, outspoken atheists. You all know the terms, I think.
Yeah, militant, outspoken. Anyone who speaks with non-deferential clarity. And that's actually a fair point. I know I myself can feel quite militant about the way I feel about religion and what it does to people, and the ways that I am not okay with that.
Yeah.
But we come from very different perspectives, and so I think it's important to look at why we are both where we are. To that end, Rene, I at least grew up in the faith, so I have a connection to Christianity and religion. It has affected my life largely in very negative ways. So I can look and say, these are my reasons, this is what I lived through, and this is why I'm really not okay with this. But you live in Germany, where there may be a lot of paper Christians, but nobody really seems to take it all that seriously. What brought you to the position of basically where we are now, where you really decided not just that it wasn't literally true or what have you, but that you actually wanted to oppose religion?
Yeah. I would say my story about how I became an anti-theist, which I identify as closely tied to how I became an atheist. So,
Fair enough.
or sort of also how I joined Twitter and my entire Twitter journey. So pretty much how I started on Twitter was when I heard in school about intelligent design or about creationism still being a thing. When I heard about it, I did a little bit of research. I also, during my period of my deconversion, watched the Ken Ham Bill Nye debate.
Yeah, that debate figures in a lot of people's deconversion stories. I wonder if Ken Ham knows that. Anyway, sorry, please go ahead.
And one thing which I then remembered back when I was in my deconversion and when I was like my atheism pretty much started at the end of my school education, and pretty much after that school education, then I also joined Twitter, and I remembered during that time when I watched the Ken Ham Bill Nye debate, I remembered, hey, I have a Twitter account. Maybe maybe I can see if Ken Ham also has a Twitter account, and I presume that he touts his anti-evolution stuff on his Twitter account. I found it really quick, and then I was like, well, okay, I'm not going to be an outspoken atheist. I'm not going to be this in your face, there's no God type person, but I do think I know a decent amount of science, and I do know that I would be doing people a service if I try to help them about understanding evolution and why creationism is reasonable and why they should accept this, to my mind, more rational view. And what I then discovered is people were hostile towards that. They didn't like me arguing against creationism. They didn't like me arguing against Genesis. And what I then figured out is that the problem with their position is merely that they don't understand science, even though that is a huge portion of it.
Oh, certainly.
The real problem with their position is that they value the Bible or their text or Genesis over science. They take that as the first principle, and people aren't creationists because of science. People are creationists primarily because of the Bible. And once I figured that out, once I figured out what was at the root of this problem, and not just really for Ken Ham, for whom I knew that was true, but also for a huge amount of his followers, pretty much for everyone who I encountered there, I realized, okay, evolution now is a symptom. The real problem here is this dogmatism. The real problem is faith. The real problem is religion. And at that point, then I decided, yeah, this root of the problem is what needs to be combated. And then I also was lucky enough to meet Godless Mom, who followed me on Twitter. So I got introduced to various Twitter atheists, and I also got later introduced to you, luckily.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah, by that time I already was an outspoken atheist, but yeah, then I decided, okay, I was going to start as an outspoken atheist, but if I am to be a difference maker for the world, then, or really be a difference maker for people and build better beliefs and help people build better beliefs, then this root of the issue needs to be addressed and needs to be combated. So
Very
that's why I'm an anti-theist.
No, that's perfectly fair. What
What has been your story, sort of in more detail?
oh, and I noticed that lot of a lot of the on the ground anti-theists are people like Dan Barker, people like Jerry DeWitt, people like from the Atheist Experience, Matt
Matt
Dillahunty,
Dillahunty, Aaron Ra,
yeah, people like Aaron Ra,
Veritas, the
Andrew,
list
yeah,
goes on.
the list goes on. You're quite right. Um, we've all been personally negatively affected by religion. Not just in the sense of it goes deeper than religion wanting you to do bad things or believe false things. Those are both problems, don't get me wrong. But it's more than that. And it's always been more than that. It wants your identity. It wants your moral and intellectual integrity. And when you go through the indoctrination for that, you haven't had the chance to develop any of those things yet on their own. So you don't realize what's being done to you.
Yeah.
And I have some pretty strong objections to people trying to take over my moral and intellectual autonomy. But I know that there's always been this, this pushback. Oh, you're just an angry atheist, blah, blah, blah. As though anger somehow invalidated my objection, as though the possession of an emotion towards, honestly, just horrific abuse a lot of the time somehow made that then a worthless, irrational position. Which of course we don't do in any other area of life. We don't say, "Oh, you hate child abusers." Well, you're just being irrationally angry.
You
Nobody
hate
says,
racism or misogyny or something like that.
"Yeah, yeah, you hate some horrible anti-human bias that is destroying people's lives. Clearly, you're just being closed-minded." We don't do that. Um, and I think it's because a lot of people, even people who are not particularly strong believers themselves, they don't want to consider the idea that faith could itself be really toxic.
Yeah.
Possibly because of histories of racism, things like what the Jews endured in the Holocaust. I think often because they have family members, aunts, little old ladies that, are good people and hold that these are good things, and they don't feel comfortable condemning people they've cared about as believing something truly abhorrent. Um, and a lot of that sort of unwillingness to address the evil and toxicity of faith, it's a great source of frustration for me
Yeah,
because people want to make these half concessions and these, oh, it's the, well, what Professor Stroop has been talking about with the no true Christian. Oh no, those aren't true Christians. Those are just, bad people abusing Christianity for their own wicked ends. And yet, I, I've been evangelical. I've held those toxic beliefs. I can assure you, nobody is more sincere than those people.
yeah. One thing which I do want to say about the points you brought up, the following is sort of a statement that I read from a presuppositional source.
Ugh.
I'm a glutton for punishment. I yeah,
God, even I'm not that much of a masochist.
yeah, but what it essentially said there, and I might be paraphrasing, I might not be, I don't know. It's,
Mm.
it's been a few weeks. What this person there said is that God demands and requires of us no less than the sacrifice of our intellect, reason, and our faculties. That they need to submit to the supposed word of God.
Hmm. And that
And
that has
if you
been the
tell,
Christian faith, yeah.
yeah, and if you want to tell me that that isn't a toxic attitude to have, that that isn't a attitude to hold, that can be hugely damaging, then simply I don't know what to tell you at that point.
Mhm.
And
I
what
Yeah.
I also wanted to say is, while I personally have not been harmed by faith
Hmm.
as a person myself, I do experience it. For instance, with my gay friends, I do experience it with. I do experience it online when I'm threatened with hell or when I'm insulted
Hmm.
for being an atheist, and I also experience it with friends who tell me their stories about how faith has fucked with them and what Christianity has done to them, and what Islam also is doing to people. There's a person on Twitter, I think his name is Hammer, something like that, who is being hunted and persecuted. His family wants him dead because he's no longer Muslim.
Yep. Yeah. And
All those sort of things.
Christianity hasn't burned people for apostasy in a long time, but they did do it, and let's not pretend they didn't. And it was because of their sincerity that they did it. It was because they took their faith seriously. Nobody
Yeah.
burns people for something they're not taking seriously. Um, but I have
And
to
in
admit,
fact, what I want
Mhm.
to say, this isn't the case in Western society, but at least in Africa, there's still Christian militias who burn supposed witches.
Oh, that's quite true.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
also, what I did want to say about these supposed no true Christians, and I think at this point we should change the name to the no true Christian fallacy, is,
It's certainly been applied to them more than to any Scotsman.
yeah, it's there. If the Bible was word of God, then it shouldn't even allow to be misconstrued in a way that supports slavery or whatever they're against. I do think that the Bible does support slavery, but
Oh, it
even
does.
if it doesn't, then we shouldn't have a text that can be interpreted in such a way that it can be abused in this way.
Yeah, the Bible, the Bible is a pretty awful book. And if you're going to look at what it actually says, um, in general, doing the opposite is going to be your best bet. Not always, but more often than you think. About what people have experienced and harm and everything, I have to say, I do not understand. And I have never understood in the whole of my life why it has to be me who has suffered some particular thing. People are like, well, you didn't go through it. I'm like, so? Like, as if somehow an injustice is only an injustice if I suffer it?
Yeah.
Like,
And
what
as if as
kind
if
of
we
a soulless bastard are you?
and
They
as if
talk
we
about kids.
and as if we simply shouldn't care if it does personally affect us. Right? I mean,
Yeah,
just
well, what
because
kind of a soulless bastard are you if I say children are starving? Well, my children aren't starving.
yeah.
Uh, excuse me? And
Or
it's so frustrating.
there are people thrown off buildings for being gay in the Near East. Well, that didn't happen to you. Well, it's still problematic, right?
It's so incredibly evil to only and these are the same people who want to manipulate emotions all the time. Their idea of evangelical outreach is to, try and get you in this manipulated emotional state and then get you around to their way of thinking. They even consider that to be God softening your heart with hardships to be prepared to receive the gospel, um, which is a good way to convince people who to unintentionally love bomb the vulnerable into a toxic belief system. But these same people, they have no difficulty saying, even good things, saying like, let's raise money against cancer because cancer hurts people and we don't want, let's raise money for World Vision so we can feed starving children. And they go for the emotional ploy and it works a lot of the time. And it should, because starving children is bad. And we should feel bad about that. We should want to help. We should help. That's all fine. But somehow when it's religion, any possession of emotion on my part is invalidates my point. And if I experienced it personally, then I'm just bitter. And if I didn't experience it personally, then why am I bothering myself with it? And it's like, I do you hear yourselves? Do you ever actually sit down and think, what did I do to my humanity that this is the position I'm taking?
Yeah. I have no idea, but one thing which I also want to say about churches helping starving children, like one thing which they regularly do is when they donate to starving children, they in Africa they make this they combine this sort of with them also preaching the gospel, like, yeah, you African children, you will get your food, but first let me tell you about Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
which I also find important. But
Yeah, absolutely.
one
Feed a
thing
person
which
because
I
they're hungry.
yeah one thing which I did want to ask you, because I gave you my personal reasons for being an anti-theist and my personal journeys for this. What I would want to ask you is what is your sort of your journey, and how have you been affected, and why are you passionate about this thing personally?
Well, there are several reasons. But what it came down to, what flipped the switch for me, is that Christianity isn't true, which means intentionally or not, a lot of people were lying to me my whole life, and a lot of people told lies for a lot of history to keep this idea going. And they they weren't always doing it unconsciously. I mean, I have seen the kind of rationalization where, you know, should we do this? Oh, but it'll help the gospel, you know? I've seen that. That is a real thing, and it is far more common than people want to admit.
So,
If you have to lie to just let me finish.
okay,
Um,
sorry.
If you have to lie to defend a perspective, you shouldn't be defending it ever.
Yeah.
That's not okay. You need to like you need to start noticing the connection between things. You know, there are people who I don't believe a word that comes out of their mouth. And it's not because I take and assess and look at the evidence on everything they say. It's because I've seen them lying and shit stirring enough times that I know not to trust them. An ideology that makes you come up with so many dishonest excuses and dance around. If you have the truth, why do you have to be so cunning and dishonest? Why? It doesn't make any sense. And the truth of the matter is, too, it was never just about me. I don't like being lied to. It's not a good idea to lie to me. I get really pissed off. But it goes far beyond that. IQ Squared is a debate forum, one of the most famous and probably the most watched debate ever. Was one in the UK, closely followed by the Science versus God one with Krauss. But I think the most watched one had to be the proposition the Catholic Church is a force for good in the world.
I watched that one.
Yeah. Now, I'm fairly certain the term hitch slap existed before that, but if it hadn't, that would have been enough to justify it. The pro-Catholic side was, I mean, these were, educated, intelligent people. These were not young earth creationists. We are not talking about debating some disingenuous half-wit like Ken Ham.
Ray Comfort.
Oh, God. Is that even debate? I don't know that he has a level of cognition that can be considered to rise to the level of debate. But yeah, that's not what any of that was dealing with. You're dealing with, politicians and archbishops. And the proposition that the Catholic Church is a force for good in the world got spanked, absolutely destroyed. And it's one of the things that convinced me of how false Christianity is, because you look at history. If a group, someone in a group tells a lie one time, that doesn't invalidate it. But if that group has had to fudge and bully and push and lie and fiddle and tint for all of history, they're not on the right side of anything.
Yeah.
So when you looked at what they were discussing a lot of times the harm that the Catholic Church has caused. Because the Catholic Church doesn't just say, we don't agree with condom use. They go to Africa, to poor areas, to superstitious areas, to areas where they actually believe in things like witches. And they say condoms increase the risk of cancer. If you use condoms, you are more likely of AIDS. If you use condoms, you are more likely to get AIDS. That's what they say.
That's a lie.
Yeah, I know, but think about, these are people so desperate that some of them believe having sex with a virgin will cure it. I want you to imagine the kind of abuses that has led to.
Yeah. Way
That's,
too much.
yeah. Again, something the Catholic Church has become remarkably good at promoting. Think about children born as a result of that with AIDS, in a place unable to feed them, with a horrible disease. It is absolutely certain that tonight A child is going to die in terror and agony as a direct result of the teachings of the Catholic Church being put into practice.
Yeah.
There is no universe in which I cannot object to that. And there is no universe in which your feelings and your discomfort with the realities of what faith has done is more important than that child's life. It's not. I'm sorry it makes you uncomfortable. I'm sorry it hurts. But you know what? Reality hurts. And that child deserves better.
Yeah. What I do want to say about that and about the debate is the proponents for the proposition that the Catholic Church was a force for good. They weren't just hitch-slapped, they were hitch-beaten straight into the hospital.
They were hitch nuked. One
Yeah.
of whom, by the way, was a British member of Parliament and the other an archbishop. So these are highly educated, articulate, intelligent people.
Yes.
And not insincere either, in my opinion.
Yeah. But one thing which I did want to say, and this is one of my main issues with apologetics and with apologists in general, when you take a look at people like William Lane Craig or Frank Turek, I know for a fact, and I've seen it for myself, that they are lying and they know they are lying. In one instance, for example, when William Lane Craig debated Sam Harris, he deliberately misquoted Harris and deliberately accused Harris of something that he was outright arguing against. And William Lane Craig also often, when he debates with internet skeptics, he also misconstrues their points. And the same is true for Frank Turek, the same is true for any apologist and professional apologist I've ever encountered. And when you know that they defend their beliefs with lies, then their beliefs aren't true.
Yeah. Well, and honestly, simple-mindedness too. I spoke of the people in that debate as being, educated Christians, and they are. The the Archbishop Obujanayan does, I'm sure he accepts evolution and science in at least other areas. A lot of the popular apologists stick to creationism, honestly, probably for sales reasons. But their defenses are so painfully dishonest. And they involve such disingenuous, like Lee Strobel, the one who pretends to have been a devout atheist and then was convinced by the evidence.
Yeah.
You know why none of us believe him? Because
Why?
he's always fucking lying. He's always fucking lying. People who come up with a good testimony to sell a shit ton of books to Christians, this is not a new strategy. And, take his case for a creator, which
Yeah.
was supposed to defend, I guess a vague sort of intelligent design, but ended up basically proposing or being a proponent of creationism.
Yeah.
11 chapters on science. 11.
Yeah.
It wasn't until the 7th chapter that he spoke to anyone who had a degree that even mentioned the word science.
Yeah.
And that was the proponent of intelligent design who was called up on the floor for lying all through his testimony in the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial, which granted had not come out by the time of that. That had not happened when that book first came out. Fine. But if this is the quality of scientific opinion you're bringing to the table, someone who was literally caught in perjury to defend their intelligent design notions. An honest person would at least consider taking a step back and saying, okay, maybe this isn't quite all the way I think it is. You know, even if you were just to get a higher understanding of God, I've seen theological students just face palming at things William Lane Craig says, because if you have any kind of nuanced understanding of the theology and the history and the Bible itself and the analysis and scholarship, he sounds like an idiot child. And I'm talking about Christians, theology students, not generally atheists. Just gonna throw that out there. Typically.
Yeah. One thing which I would say about Lee Strobel, I do believe him when he says that he was a former atheist. What I would not believe him on was that he based his beliefs on evidence. I don't believe him on that, because I do think that he, like most Christians, bases his beliefs on the witness of the Holy Spirit, as they call it. And number two, I don't think that as an atheist he was particularly informed about his views. I think he was more of an apathetic atheist who didn't think much about this stuff, and then he fell for the apologetic bullcrap, which promotes himself.
Yeah, well, and now he's getting a good paycheck out of it.
Yeah.
Several, in fact. And, if there was any integrity in him, I would feel sorry for him. I feel bad for ministers who, had to go through the Clergy Project. And the fact that the Clergy Project exists is itself pretty good evidence that Christianity does not give you what it promises. Because the Clergy Project is specifically and exclusively for pastors who can't believe anymore. And, yeah, you don't want to lie, but you took a job. You took a job with certain expectation, and now you don't have any other skills, and you've got children and a mortgage and a family, and, you can't just walk in one day and be like, oh, turns out this is all bullshit. Peace. Yeah.
Like standing before the congregation. Yeah, I know, guys, I told you last week, nothing can separate us from the love of the Father, but I just found out that, yeah, the Bible is really bullshit. I'm not a Christian anymore. You shouldn't be either. So, peace out, guys.
Yeah, that, not so much.
Yeah.
And in fairness, I could see why a congregation would not be okay with that, because they did hire a minister, not that. Yeah.
The last thing a churchgoer would want to see is this pastor turning atheist and his pastor telling him, yeah, what I told you all along here is not true, because that, of course, gives this person doubt, and doubt is lethal to faith.
It is. Well, and I notice this is one of the things that, for me, faith is the very concept of faith, the methodology of thinking. A lot of people say, oh, science says this, science says that, blah, 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 blah. Science says it's impossible for a bumblebee to fly. No, it doesn't. But the thing is, science isn't the body of knowledge. Science has a body of knowledge, a very good comprehensive body of knowledge. It's excellent. It's very useful. But that's not what science is at its base.
It's a method.
Exactly. Science is a method of thought and investigation, which is perhaps best described as systematic doubt. It is literally, by definition, the opposite of faith.
Yeah.
And it doesn't want faith. It's not selfish to want results from something because only accurate information has practical application. That's how we know if a thing is true. You try it out, and if you were wrong, it's not going to work.
Yeah. And then
If
you
you,
either revise your hypothesis or you abandon it altogether.
yeah, depending on how bad the fail was.
Yeah.
And granted, any reasonable hypothesis should be tested several times, but still,
Yeah.
that's
Well,
it's a method of thought, and faith is a belief that is based in conviction instead of
yeah.
evidence. You may look for evidence after the fact, but if you have to look for evidence for the position you already possess, there's something wrong with that. There is
Yeah.
something very, very wrong with that.
One thing which I want to say is basically what theology it boils down to is we observe within the world, and what we observe within the world, it tells us what God must be like, and when we observe this in the world, then God has these and these qualities. What they never do, never ever say, well, okay, God has these qualities, so if he has these qualities, then we should expect this and this and this in the world. Those are predictions. Let's find out if it's true. Christians won't touch that with a 10-foot pole.
No, well, because they're not looking to discover and infer God from nature, though they will claim that's what they're trying to do. They're going to their doctrines and saying, okay, what do we, I say in snotty quotation marks, know about God?
Yeah,
Okay, how can we find evidence for this in nature? It's the exact opposite of what you should be doing, of
yeah.
course. Just saying, what are
But
the facts? What do the
yeah,
facts tell us?
what I'm basically trying to say is, if everyone treated Christianity like a scientific hypothesis, which comes with predictions, which hypothesis which will be abandoned or revised once the predictions that it yields don't conform to reality, then there wouldn't be Christians in this world anymore. The trouble is that is not the methodology they employ at all.
No, that isn't. And they take advantage of emotional vulnerability. They teach people to find the signs of God so that
Yeah,
someone being kind to you when you're having a bad day, well, that could be God putting them in your life and reaching out to you because, he really totally cares. Totes for real, dude, promise.
yeah,
That's the kind of thing where you're like, I already have the answer. I have to find a way to justify it.
yeah,
That is the worst way of thinking and finding truth. You will always be wrong.
yeah,
Even when you're right, you're wrong.
yeah. And such is the nature of pseudoscience, such is the nature of pseudo-apologetics and pseudoscience, pseudo-philosophy, and such is the nature of apologetics and what it always boils down to. That's what
True.
they do. And
Well,
even if Christianity was true, and even if the hypothesis somehow was right, which it definitely isn't, they're still at fault and they're still walking in blindness because their methodology they use leads to blindness,
one
even
of the
if they are
things
right.
that got me out of Christianity, one of the things I told myself as I was going into questioning was, hey, I should be able to question something, and if it's true, it'll be fine. The truth should stand up to questions.
Yeah,
And that's quite true. Um, it should. And it Christianity didn't. Or rather, it did if you were willing to do as we were trained to do. And I assure you, we were trained in very explicit detail to only look at the sources that gave us the right answer, the answer we were already taught. We should,
i.e., the answer which supports our position.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because again, and this is where you get when you believe in, demons are deceiving people with, facts and logic and such. I'm sorry, could you be more ridiculous?
Yeah. Like, where would one go from there if you have a person who believes that demons are deceiving people with logic? Like, that's a non-starter. I mean, at that point, you're talking with a person who has abandoned reason in favor of faith.
Trying to argue with a man who has renounced the use of reason is like administering medicine to the dead or trying to convert an atheist by use of scripture. Thomas
Yeah.
Jefferson.
Great
But
quote.
it's funny when you were talking about looking at, nature as a way to infer signs of God. It's it's kind of funny. I was there came to mind, this is sort of a possibly apocryphal story, where a theologian inquired, what could we conclude about the Creator from the study of His creation? And a naturalist responded, an inordinate fondness for beetles, because there are ridiculous numbers of beetles on the planet, just different. Insects are the most prolific of the animal kingdom. Among insects, there are the most different species of beetles. It's the sheer quantity of beetles on the planet is ridiculous. That is a far more rational supposition taken from the works of the Creator, if you want to call it that,
Yeah.
than anything theology has ever produced.
Yeah.
Because
But that, of course,
it follows from the information,
yeah.
you know?
But that, of course, does make the Christian or the Muslim or whatever feel fuzzy inside, so we reject it.
It's true. And people do things like, well, then how does X work? Or then how do we get rainbows? It always ever breaks down to one of two things. I feel feelings when I look at pretty, so magic. Or I don't know how that works, so magic.
Yeah.
And those are truly treating things with the mindset of a child. And I have put away childish things.
Yeah.
But on that note, I think I'd like to hear from our audience. What do you think about atheism, about anti-theism? Do you identify as an anti-theist? And why? What is it that concerns you about faith? Are there things about it that bother you? And if so, what are they? I would love to see your responses in the comments below. Please tweet at us at Veritas Voices, or Rene and myself are both on Twitter as well.
Links will be below.
Absolutely. Now, next week, we will be doing, I believe, the results of the survey for the renaming of crazy Christian tweets, since we do have to include the other crazy faiths, which have plenty of crazy to contribute, and it's not fair to cut them out of the conversation. So the vote was strongly on the side of batshit believers. So it will be our first episode of tweets from batshit believers next week, and I really look forward to that.
Same.
Rene, you found some amazing ones.
Yeah.
Gonna have to
But
do a bit of research.
yeah. But that said, if any of you guys out there have recommendations about some tweets you may have found, please feel also free to send us these recommendations. We love to feature what our audience suggests to us.
Absolutely. We always want to hear from you. Ideas are great. Questions are wonderful. Whatever. Just, we like to hear from our friends. Anyway, with that in mind, I hope you all have a wonderful week and reason bless.